Thank you for joining us for this session of Justice in Action. My name is Cheryl Parker, and I'm the director of the Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility at Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. If this is your first time joining us, Justice in Action is a conversation series about the various ways COVID-19 has impacted and exacerbated existing inequalities in New York City. It's hosted by the JCC's Social Justice Activist in Residence, Ruth Messinger. Today's conversation is on secular education in the Ultra-Orthodox and Chassidic communities. Joining Ruth on our panel are Naftuli Moster, founder and executive director of Yaffed, Young Advocates for Fair Education; Beatrice Weber, whose son attends a Hasidic yeshiva; Chavi Weisberger, director of community engagement at Footsteps; and Jamie Hooper, a private school teacher and parent. We encourage you to ask questions during the session. You can do this by entering them into the Q&A feature that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible toward the end of the program. Two final notes before we get started. First, I want to offer a big thank you to our program co-sponsors, the JCC Center for Jewish Living, Avodah, B'nai Jeshurun, Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, Footsteps, the JTS Handel Center for Ethics and Justice, the National Council of Jewish Women New York, Romemu, and Central Synagogue. And finally, while we are committed to hosting this conversation series, we want you to know that the views and opinions expressed by our panelists do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the co-hosts or the JCC. I hope you enjoy the program. Ruth?
Thank you so much, Cheryl, and welcome to 4 guests. So this presentation, this section of Justice in Action, which Cheryl has introduced to you, is a little bit different than some, for those of you who tune in regularly, because we decided to pick up on an issue of, we think, significant importance in the Jewish community in New York that's not particularly aggravated by COVID. It's just a position on a set of issues that have existed pre-COVID and that are continuing to exist. This session, however, is very much like all of the other sessions we do in that we will both be trying to brief all of you on a situation that exists that some of you may be quite familiar with, but that for others will be new. And we're talking about something for which there is an advocacy agenda. And so we will be letting people know how you can respond to what you learn and who are the particular people who might be able to be helpful in addressing the issue at a systemic level. I'm going to start with Naftuli because he is the person who both founded Yaffed and brought it to my attention. And I know it's hard to do this in just a few minutes, Naftuli, but I'll trust you to bounce some of your observations off of Beatrice and Chavi and Jamie. I wonder if you could just pretend for a minute that this is an audience that doesn't really know anything about the state of secular education in Hasidic yeshivas, and talk a little bit about what it's like, what it was like for you and what it's like today for a boy or a young man to be in a Hasidic yeshiva where he goes to study.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you so much for hosting this panel. So, my name is Naftuli Moster, in case it wasn't clear. I attended a Hasidic yeshiva my entire life, basically since I was 2.5 to 19 or 20 years old. In elementary and middle school, our school days looked at pretty much as follows. We attended yeshiva from 9 a.m. till about 5 p.m. or 4:30 p.m. Almost the entire school day was Judaic studies till 3:30 p.m. or so. And then we switched over to what we called English, and it was supposed to be secular studies. That segment consisted of about an hour to 90 minutes, depending on the grade. And we learned basic English and arithmetic. This happened 4 days a week only because on Friday, we ended early because of Shabbos. So this was the case for most grades in elementary and middle school. I say most because it doesn't happen in 1st or 2nd grade and it ends before you reach high school. But once we entered high school, our school days got extended significantly, if you can imagine that. So at that point, we started attending yeshiva from as early as 6:30 or 7 a.m. and we studied and we stayed in yeshiva till 8:30 or 9 p.m. In some yeshivas, it's even longer than that. So we're talking about a good 12 to 14 hours a day. And all of it was Judaic studies only. And I don't think some people in the public don't comprehend. When we say we didn't get a secular education, we are not talking about evolution or other, who knows what kind of taboo topics. We're talking about English, math, science, social studies. People can't process that you can attend school in New York State and New York City for 4 years in high school and get zero secular education, or in elementary school and get a maximum of 90 minutes a day. I didn't even get into the part where the quality is basically really poor. The teachers are not qualified. The kids have the attitude that it's not important. But this kind of like gives you a bit of a snapshot of what it looks like. And this, obviously, I'm telling it from my experience, but this is happening to approximately 65,000 children in New York State. And keep in mind, I'm excluding the female population, and you'll hear soon why, and I'm excluding other ultra-Orthodox groups. I am talking about 65,000 Hasidic boys who are being denied a basic education.
Okay, and we're going to come back to the why of that and to the social interest in possibly changing it, but I wonder first if Beatrice, could you come and explain your perspective on all of this and pick up on what Naftuli was talking about as to what the education is like?
Yeah, so I'm a mother of 10 children, 6 of them boys, all who attended Hasidic yeshivas either in Rockland County, Muncie, or now in Brooklyn. My little one is 8 years old now, and he is in a Hasidic school. I actually filed a lawsuit just over a year ago. This was always an issue of the children not receiving even a basic education. So even the very, very bright boys would be hampered. I see that happening with my son now. He's slowly losing ground with what is meant to happen for a third grader, even though he's a really, really bright boy. So I try to supplement, give him books to read, buy him books to do when he comes home from school. But as Naftuli just mentioned, even though he's 8 years old, his day starts, he gets onto the bus at 8, his day starts at 8:30 and finishes at 5, and he comes home at 5:30, right? So he's out of the house from 8 till 5:30 at the age of 8.
And just say a word about what secular education he does get or doesn't get.
His secular studies starts at 3:45 and ends at 5. From Monday through Thursday. He's taught by a Yiddish-speaking Judaic study teacher who does this on the side at the end of his Judaic study teaching, comes to his class and teaches him. He recently told me, my son, I speak English better than my teacher does. So the teacher, you can't even blame the teacher. He's told to get into that classroom, keep the kids busy. If you teach them the alphabet, that's fine. It's very common for Hasidic boys to not be able to fill out a job application, to go to a doctor. I worked in a clinic for several years in the community, to not be able to describe what hurts them, to have to bring with their mother or put their wife on the phone with the doctor. So, my children have experienced the same. Again, I've always spoken to them in English, so they kind of had a heads up. At least they can speak English and they don't sound like an immigrant. They actually sound like they were born in the US. But at the same time, the academics are extraordinarily lacking. And there's no, I've asked for a schedule, I've asked for a curriculum, and none of that was forthcoming. And based on what I'm seeing, as an 8-year-old, they're still practicing the alphabet. He came home and said to me the word foot. He's like, my teacher told me at the end of the year, I'll know how to read this word. And to him, he's reading way past that. So yeah, this is really real. And this is affecting.
So there are lots of questions, and some of them I know will be coming in from the audience. And I want to get to Javi and Jamie in a minute, but Naftuli, I think maybe first, the next thing is you just talk about why you stepped forward as an activist, what Yaffed is and does, and give us a little bit of the idea of the dimensions of that struggle. And then I'm going to get to the other two participants.
Sure. So I began, realizing kind of what had been done to me and to many other children when I was trying to pursue a degree in psychology. I have a whole story about how complicated it was for me to even know what psychology means and what is required, what a major, what a minor is, and all that stuff. but because we didn't get any college prep, in case that's not clear to the audience, because we didn't get any prep at all, right? Even elementary, middle, and even basic education. So the point is, I was trying to get into college, and even after I got in, I was struggling immensely. And it occurred to me that what had been done to me in yeshiva was a form of neglect. And at the time, I didn't know the language that exists around it. And I Googled and I asked around, and I discovered that New York State law is crystal clear that you could be a private school, but you still need to provide an education that is, quote, substantially equivalent to public schools. And that law is not new. It has existed since 1894. And it just struck me that all these years, yeshivas have been non-compliant with the law, and no one has done anything about it. So that's when I decided I'm gonna speak up. I'm gonna speak to some attorneys and to some education officials. And it was pretty clear that they didn't want to touch it. Education officials, elected officials, many of them didn't even know the law themselves, that that private schools are supposed to provide this kind of education. But even once they realized it, once they learned about it, they were like, oh, this is tough. It's a private school, and it's a powerful community and things like that. Or we're concerned, we're going to overstep our boundaries. They're always afraid whether they're going to be accused of anti-Semitism or they're going to be taken to court for supposedly violating religious freedoms. And the price, the people who pay the price are the tens of thousands of children who ultimately grow up to be adults and are not able to pursue these kinds of degrees. So that's why, that's when and why I founded Yaffed.
That's very helpful. Javi, I'm going to go to you next, and I'm going to ask you to take a minute of the 2 minutes that I'm going to give you just to tell people what Footsteps is, so that they have that piece of the picture. And then maybe you would pick up to talk about your own connection to this issue, what you learned from your work at Footsteps, but also why the situation is different for boys and girls.
All right, I'll try to stick to the time allotment.
Don't worry.
So I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Footsteps. Footsteps, for those who aren't familiar, is a nonprofit that supports folks who were raised ultra-Orthodox, who are looking to transition to a life of their choosing. And so the overlap should be pretty obvious. So many of our members are yeshiva boys who come to Footsteps at 18 years old, at 20 years old, at 40 years old, and say, I need to, I'm trying to transition out of this community. How do I make a living? How do I actually start functioning in the world? And very often this means we need to start from the ABCs, literally, get people to start feeling comfortable reading and speaking in English, helping them figure out how to get an education, get their GED, go to college, so that they can be employable and actually be able to survive in the world outside. So the work that Footsteps does is so important, and we lean heavily and support so much what the work that Yaffed does. There's a lot of overlap in the community we serve. But I want to take us backwards for a minute and say, so personally, where I think this work is so important, separate from my professional life, is I have 3 children. My son is 15 years old. When I was still Hasidic and in the community, my son was in a Hasidic yeshiva, and his school day was very much as Beatrice and Naftuli described it to be. And as a parent in the community, I didn't even know that I had the option to want something different for my child. I was angry because my child was suffering. He was struggling through his school day. He also has other needs that the school just wasn't addressing. And he just was asked to sit in his seat all day and study, Torah studies, when he is super smart and curious and interested in learning all these different things, but there was so little provided and offered for him. And then even when I left the community, I no longer identify as Hasidic. I now, wish that I can support my child in having better opportunities. But there's all these complicated legal issues and custody stuff that get involved. So here's a child who, he's paying the price for a system that's completely ignoring his needs and his right to a basic education so he could survive in the world as he grows up. And I'm sorry, I went up on a tangent a little bit, but
that's okay.
Because
Let me switch to Beatrice and just ask her really two questions. Beatrice, the first one is explain, if you can, the difference for boys' education and girls' education and what's at the root of that. But also, probably no surprise to you, Beatrice, the question has already come in on the chat and would relate to differently to Javi, but why do you continue to send your children to the yeshivot if that's if you see what they're not getting?
Okay. So in regards to the first question, boys have always gotten way less. And part of it is probably because of the kind of commandment for boys to learn, right? So from a young age, to learn is not considered anything secular, right? You're talking about the Talmud, Mishnah. They introduced them to the Mishnah probably at age 7. They're introducing them to the Mishnah and Talmud, I don't know, maybe age 10. And as Naftuli mentioned, those days are really extended by the time they turn 13 or 14. So they're out of the house till 8 or 9 learning, where the big emphasis for girls learning these subjects, actually they don't learn Talmud or Mishnah at all, but in general, learning the Jewish subjects is not given that high priority. So they kind of have half a day and half a day versus the boys where it's probably like 85% and 15%. With the girls, it's like 50-50. In regards to why my children are in a Hasidic yeshiva is not married anymore. And as part of the divorce agreement, which I signed on several years ago, there was that clause included in a very vague form, but it still is being held as that I need to keep my children in the same school as they were in previously.
Can I jump though on this because
yes.
I want the audience to be clear that even if Beatrice's response is, my custody agreement requires me to send my kids to yeshivas, the question could still be, why do tens of thousands of parents send their kids to these yeshivas? The truth is, for many of them, they don't know any better. They don't know what an education is, just like I didn't until I was 21. But the truth is also, people have a misconception about how the Hasidic community operates. The Hasidic community consists of multiple sects, large ones. Some of our audience has heard of Satmar, they've heard of Lubavitch, but they don't know that there is Belz, Bobiv, Pupa, Skver, Vizhnitz. There's basically a dozen very large sects, and then there are a dozen smaller ones, and then there are tiny ones. But the point is, when you grow up in a certain sect, there's an expectation that you send your kids to that sect. I mean, you pray in the shul of the sect, you send your kids to the schools of the sect, the boys in the boys' schools, the girls in the girls' schools, you marry within the sect. So people need to understand that this isn't much of a choice. It's as though you grow up on an island and there's only one school, and that's where you're sending your kid. That's the real reason. And if you wanted to be this outcast who's going to be like, I'm going to pull my son out and put him in a different school, your son is not going to have friends on Shabbos when you go back to the other shul, right? It's literally like taking a fish out of water, right? If this is all you know from the moment you were born, you're surrounded by this. You go Friday night, you go to Tish. That's like a certain, I don't know how to describe it, but it's a certain event that Hasidim participate almost every Friday night. This is your people, and it's a very immersive kind of experience. And that's why it is so complicated for anyone to even contemplate taking out their kids from these yeshivas. Oh, and another thing is, let's say you want to take your kid out of Belz and put them into Bobiv or into Satmar, same education. So as long as you're going to choose a Hasidic yeshiva, almost always it's going to be the same education. There's only like 1 or 2 that provide a slightly better education, still nothing that comes close to what's being offered in public schools or other private schools, still nothing that comes close to what the law requires. But the point is the options are extremely limited, and it comes with a lot of consequences and stigma if you were to do that.
That's very helpful. Jamie, I think it's important for us to, yes, I see Beatrice, but I want to just bring Jamie in. I want him to explain his perspective on all of this, because that will give us a broader picture as we go on with the rest of the hour. Jamie?
Sure. Yes, thank you. And I'm absolutely honored to be here with my colleagues here. My position in this comes from a very different place. I, first and foremost, want to identify myself as an ally. I actually was not raised in a Jewish family. Both of my parents were professors. I was immersed head to toe every day in secular education. However, there are 2 elements of the work that I do which has aligned me with the mission. One is that I am a board member of Footsteps. And in my work at Footsteps, my first role was to be the chairman of what do we call the scholarship committee. Footsteps, as part of its work, offers scholarships. This year we awarded just shy of 150 scholarships to Footstep members who were raised in circumstances exactly like Javi and Naftuli, learned English on their own, cleared the GED, and now would like to go to college. As part of my work with the organization, I read through and helped the staff process the applications, which included essays from each applicant. These essays, I started doing this work 3 years ago, absolutely changed my world and changed my view of how the world works. I was in shock. It was one essay after another that in detail told the story of receiving no secular education whatsoever. People who did not know how to multiply single-digit numbers or even add them. People who did not know how to speak the English language. People who did not know how to read a novel, let alone a short story or even a sentence. So that was a big game changer for me. And that's how I ended up meeting Naftuli and engaging in this work. Also, I want to mention that I married into a Jewish family and I actually converted to Judaism. So I'm sort of going the opposite way as a lot of Footsteppers. That happened 8 years ago. And for the last 6 years, I'm a Jewish educator. So I teach middle school math at a school in Manhattan called the Yeshiva School. The Yeshiva School is really the only of its kind in New York. What we do is we work with children who have been diagnosed with specific language-based learning disabilities. So they're in every way typical children, but have difficulty learning how to read. Most of our students come not from the yeshivas that are being discussed here. They are from yeshivas which teach secular and Judaic studies. So for example, we get students from Yeshiva Flatbush, which is a well-known, very prestigious school that teaches secular studies. I will tell you though, that I have seen firsthand, in the case of our students, all of whom are Orthodox families, I have seen firsthand the effect that a lack of education, an inability to read, an inability to execute basic math, what it does to the psyche of a child. And it is devastating. It's absolutely devastating. So we're talking about major self-esteem issues. We're talking about disruption in the family unit where homework they're screaming and crying over homework because it's not understood by the child. It is very, very difficult road for a child to hoe, to not receive a secular education or to not understand the material. So I understand the problem that we're talking about in a slightly different way, but I have seen it firsthand. So with my identity as a Jewish person and now as a Jewish educator, I am both emotionally and intellectually very, very aligned with the mission that we're talking about here.
I think it's very important for us to have your voice here. Beatrice, you had your hand up before. I want to go to you, and then I'm going to switch the questioning a little bit.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of, I guess, double down on what Naftuli was talking about parents having choice of where to send their school. There is an incredible amount of social pressure and stigma. It goes way beyond, not having friends with your kids to play with. You pay a very, very high price, whether being threatened that your other kids won't be able to attend that school, whether you won't be able to find matches for right? Everybody, it's all, you get married through a matchmaker, right? And that's kind of a big thing. So, you will not be able to marry off your children. Financial, your business will be impacted. People will spread rumors about you that you did this, and then you won't be accepted in the community as a business resource. So the price of speaking up, and I know people have spoken to me privately and thanked me for speaking up, and I'm sure the other people in the audience can say the same, how people are so in the community are so afraid to speak up about this issue, and definitely afraid to make those changes. And I think that's an important reference point, because when you live in the general society in the United States or New York, you can't believe that that's a reality for the person on the next block, but it really is. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
No, that's very helpful. Naftuli, maybe you tell me if you think that we have to do more before you make this pivot, but maybe I'm thinking you might want to go back to as you say, the cases and the challenges you brought, and a little bit about your dealing with the city and state. One of the questions in the chat box, which I thought was a very powerful question, was, is this a problem of the yeshivot and the heads of the sects, or is this a problem of the politicians? And that's a very good way to take a look at it.
So it's a great question. Obviously, the answer would be all of the above. It's a yin yang or yoga, not yoga. What am I saying? It's a dance between the two of them. But basically, you have yeshiva leaders who refuse to make any changes. I mean, first of all, refuse to properly educate for a variety of reasons. I want to maybe use this opportunity also to expand on what I think Beatrice or Javi mentioned. Basically, in the ultra-Orthodox world, every boy is, especially in the Hasidic world, every boy is groomed, or they see it as destined to grow up to be a rabbi or a Talmid Chacham, which is like a learned man. In other words, someone who continues learning. That's what they do. Torah, of course. And the women, on the other hand, are not even allowed to, I mean, they can become rabbis, and they're not allowed to study most of what the boys study, which is the Talmud. It's something that the women are prohibited from studying practically. Therefore, if the man is being groomed to become a rabbi, you need to groom the other side to grow up to be the breadwinner. So that's essentially why you have that dichotomy or whatever between the two sexes. But the point is the rabbis don't want to educate the kids. So we go to the elected officials. They have this very tight relationship with these yeshiva leaders who basically double as the Hasidic sect leaders. And there's a mutual benefit over there, right? If I'm the elected official, I get a lot of votes, which pushes me to victory. And I give you in exchange a lot of leeway, a lot of freedom, and also a lot of money. This is a part that a lot of people don't know. Yeshivas get a ton of money from both city and state funding, in addition to federal funding. So as much as we talk about them as private schools, the reality is they're very much publicly funded. So this is why, we've started this in 2012, but basically there was no one to speak to. Finally, in 2015, we coordinated a complaint that was signed by 52 yeshiva graduates who attended 39 different schools in New York City alone. We're not even talking Rockland County, Kiryas Joel. 39 yeshivas in New York City alone. And now, if you think about it in history, when social change happened because of one complaint or because of one individual, we're talking, it's not easy to get 52 people from the Hasidic community to sign a complaint when there's the risk of their names leaking and it could come back to bite them, like Beatrice described. So it's a huge thing. And that finally triggered an investigation in the New York City Department of Education. But then the politics kicked in again. So the investigation was dragged out for 4.5 years, an investigation that any of us could have concluded after 30 days, 60 days. It took them 4.5 years, and half the yeshivas refused to let the city in. And instead of actually, breaking the door down, so to speak, or using certain tools to ensure they gain access, the city basically allowed that to continue to happen. We then got a hold of internal emails where the city and the yeshiva leaders, they were basically working together, and the yeshiva leaders offered to support mayoral control, it's a complicated story, in exchange of the city delaying the investigation, and the city obliged, right? So we're up against a massive political system, but of course it happens because of the tremendous power that the ultra-Orthodox leaders have accumulated. And I should say, because we're speaking to a non-Orthodox audience, this is possible because the non-Orthodox Jewish community doesn't assert themselves in the same kind of way. They don't have the same needs, right? So it doesn't give them that opportunity to constantly engage with elected officials, to get more programs and more security and more this and more that. Therefore, it allows the Hasidic leaders to build this very tight connection, tight relationship with the government officials, who then later on, when an investigation needs to happen, they just look the other way.
Okay, so guys, I'm trying to keep my eye on the questions in the chat. So I hope that this is becoming clearer. Some of this is becoming clearer to our listeners. There is a big difference in girls and boys in terms of how they're expected to proceed with their learning, and at least an observation that one benefit of giving much more secular education to the women is that they will be expected to be breadwinners for their families. And so they need to know something. And the parallel observation, and I'm really just trying to stick with the definition, with the sharing the facts with you, is that there is an invested interest in an education, and I'm going to say a rich Jewish education for men, for boys and men, but that does not give them the kind of secular tools that they would need out in the world. One question we had, I don't know if any of you wants to speak to this, but one question we had was, do the panelists think there's any connection between these educational patterns and the lack of response to the scientific issues that are in some ways in and about the community right now, for example, with the pandemic, which might build a connection. Yes, Javi?
I'm happy to try to speak a little bit to that. I think the short answer is yes. There's definitely a correlation. Lack of education means that people don't understand science as much and understand the cause and effect of taking certain actions and how that impacts you. But I think that's the easy answer. I think the more difficult answer is the structures in the community where people are taught to just trust leadership and to do as they're told and to rely on, what the rabbi is telling them to do. And if the rabbi says, keep coming to shul, even if there's a pandemic, then people will keep coming to shul. If the rabbi says, keep sending your children to these yeshivas, even if you're not getting an education, people will keep sending the children to those yeshivas. And I think that to answer also, to link this together with another question that somebody mentioned, an example of someone who lived in Israel and his family supported him in going to the IDF. I think that it's helpful to realize that there's a lot of beauty in the Hasidic community, and I think that people want to preserve that. And I see that in the questions that people are asking. How do we still allow people to have the beautiful customs and the rituals and the things that exist in there while still helping them get that education? And I think the answer is big, broad change. For one individual who's choosing to fight to have their child educated, that means they're paying with the loss of all the other advantages that one gets from being in a tight-knit Hasidic community. The price you pay for speaking out and fighting for the difference for your own child, for you to do something better for your family, means that you're losing every other aspect of beauty that comes with being in that kind of community. It involves giving up personal interest and individual desire for whatever you want your children to have. And I think that's at the root of this, which might help explain
you're all helping with the explanation and being very respectful of the tradition, and I think that's important. Naftuli and Jamie, before we get too far into the time we have, can you explain the ways in which private schools in the city and state have become engaged in this issue, the ones that are not just Jamie's Shefa school, but the universe of private schools has become connected to this issue in the courts. And I wonder if you would explain why and how.
Great question. I'll take it first and then Jamie. So first of all, so what happened was, after these long delays when yeshivas basically stonewalled and refused to even allow the city or the state to go in and to make any improvements. At some point, New York State realized that even though there's been a law on the books since 1894 that non-public schools must provide an education that is, quote, substantially equivalent to public schools, it hasn't really properly been enforced. In fact, the guidelines that existed weren't clear enough. So local districts that are supposed to enforce it didn't even know how they're supposed to do it, or at least so they said. So the state said, let's go and revise those guidelines. Now, when you revise the guidelines based on the law, it doesn't just apply to yeshivas. In fact, it would be unconstitutional or discriminatory if you singled out Hasidic yeshivas, right? So by definition, it applies to all non-public schools. Now, granted, we don't have any suspicion that Dalton or Ramaz is not providing a proper, substantially equivalent education. But the same way, for instance, a Lexus and a Hyundai both have to go through an annual inspection, the same way, these guidelines apply to everyone. Yet, well, they didn't like that. The private elite schools, for the lack of a better term, did not like that. And they've been used to not needing any oversight. And it was mostly led by a small body, an accreditation agency called NICES, that decided to instigate and to get everyone riled up against these regulations without really telling them what they were meant, who they were meant to protect, right? And that's how they came into being. And it requires a lot of, there was a lot of disinformation that they spread, and now it requires a lot of work on our part to go around and explain, this is to protect tens of thousands of children, and the burden on you is minimal, if at all. And it was just total misinformation. So that's kind of like how it came about. But I know Jamie has his personal experience to shed light on this further.
Sure. So my wife and I have 3 children here in Manhattan who have attended 2 different non-public schools, that is to say private schools. When the regulations were put forth by the state education department and their accreditation agency, the NICES, which is the New York State Association, I think, of Independent Schools, that's the accreditation agency, they organized a letter writing campaign really encouraging the heads of every private school. This is religious schools, Catholic schools, the Jesuit schools, the secular private schools, and the Jewish day schools that teach secular education as well, all together to write to every single parent that a threat is afoot from the state. The state is now organizing a whole-scale takeover of private schools. And I want to quote from the letter that I received, if you think I'm exaggerating. I don't want to mention the school, but I will say in the first paragraph, was written, the proposed regulations would delegate the direct oversight of our school, my child's school, to the local public school superintendent and the local board of education. This would pose profound threats to our independence, jeopardizing our ability to develop curriculum, meet the individual needs of each student, i.e. your child, and hire and retain the best teachers. Okay, then, so we read this, my wife and I, as did many other parents, and we were in shock and in horror. We couldn't believe it. This is before I joined Footsteps. This is before I met Naftuli. This is before I had any understanding of what was going on and the response to the regulations. One of the first things I did once I understood this issue better was to actually print out a copy of the regulations on the website. The criteria, by the way, for, I just want to list them because they're super short. The criteria for, let's say, inspection or oversight, as they say it, is literally the criteria for the regulations to follow the law is 1, instruction given by a competent teacher, that English is the language of instruction for the academic subjects, that appropriate programs are in place to help students with English proficiency, and that also, and this benefits NICES, accreditation materials would and should be taken into account if a private school has been accredited within the last 5 years. This is a very, very low bar. There's no sharing of records. There's no sharing of my child's report card. And yet we received a letter from 2 different heads of school, essentially with the same language, saying that we should be alarmed because suddenly there was going to be some type of deep state takeover of our child's private school. So I
will say, I'm going to chime in just for a minute because I've had the same experience with a granddaughter who's a teacher at private school who came home from the first day at school from the teachers meeting and said, "What is this?" Unfortunately, I knew what it was. And I then had a subsequent discussion with the head of one of the private schools and said, I cannot understand why you're doing this because you're hurting tens of thousands of kids and there's no burden on you. And their response was, oh yes, it's government interference, but the government already has requirements that all schools need to meet. The private schools, and as Naftuli pointed out before, or one of you, many well-known yeshivas are meeting those standards. There is a group of schools that are not. And so back to that other question that was in the chat room, that in my mind is the responsibility of government, is you
Absolutely. Have. Ruth, I just want to add, well, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, please go ahead. This is your meeting. I'm trying to bounce 4 people's heads on my screen and read the chat room.
I think it really bears mentioning, and I think it's quite important. At the school I taught at previous to Shefa, I was a teacher there during its 5th year of operation, and we went through a NICES accreditation. And I just want to say to your audience and to everyone here, it is a rigorous process of accreditation. Okay, in other words, being accredited by NYSIS, in my view, and by the way, we pay tuition to support our point of view, right? Is that it offers an education that is not only substantially equivalent, but in our view, superior in many ways, with arts programs and with sort of a holistic emphasis in teaching of the whole child. These are really, really good schools who have absolutely nothing to worry about from these regulations. So that's my standpoint. And I get to live on both sides of the issue. And so that's why I wanted to make this.
No, I wanted you to do that because we will tell you near the end of the program all the ways in which you can be supportive, get more money, get more information, be helpful to Yaffed. But one of the things to point out is that some of you who are listening have a child or a grandchild or a connection to a private school. And that is one area in which to step in. Beatrice, there's a question in the chat that I don't want to lose. And somebody's asking, what are the consequences to you, or more particularly to your children, because you are an outspoken parent?
For one, I spent the day in family court with the school principal, being a witness for my ex-husband and providing testimony, how my actions are impacting my child and harming him. So
you were essentially attacked in family court for what you're doing.
Just a snippet.
Okay, I think we get it. And I think that the questioner might have been particularly concerned with whether there's negative consequence for your kids to have a mother who speaks out, which some of us have had that experience in the secular world.
Yeah, it gets tricky. It definitely gets tricky. And, my relationship with my older children is complicated as it is. They don't like the fact that I left the marriage to begin with. So definitely me speaking up is something that they don't like. My son is young, so he's not, at least at this point, directly impacted by
Okay, I don't want to push too hard.
Yeah.
Javi, yes, Javi.
Yeah, I just want to say, with so much respect and admiration for the work that Beatrice does to shed awareness on this issue. Yes, the price she and other parents pay for speaking out is really high and the children suffer. But the price for not speaking out is higher, because then you have children who are being deprived and stripped of an education. And our parental responsibility is to somehow find a balance to do right by our children and not hurt them in the process. And I have so much admiration to you, Beatrice, for the work that you're doing.
I just say, I just wanted to say that it's, for us, it's been really difficult and deflating. Because, when I first started Yaffed, even though I knew nothing about community organizing and advocacy, anything really, right? I was still, barely able to speak English properly. But the point is,
you've learned very fast, Naftuli.
Thank you. But the point is, there was always the assumption that we have a lot of support, and anyone who values education would support us all the way. And then even more so, Jewish people who value education would support us all the way. And I don't know if this was done strategically or whatever, but the way the state and because of the refusal of the yeshivas to cooperate, the way the private school community got looped into it, and the way NYSIS, this accreditation agency, instigated them. And suddenly we find ourselves, interacting with people who otherwise, are very stand up for any kind of social justice issue. And suddenly they're like, oh my God, the government is coming into my school and screw the Hasidic children. I don't care about anything. It's very demoralizing, right? These are our people. These are our supporters. These are our allies who are suddenly, so quick to say, it touches my children's school. We want nothing to do with it. And Jamie only touched upon this. What are the actual requirements? The New York State proposed regulations. The requirements are what they have been required all along, which is you teach the subjects, English, math, science, social studies, the basics, for a certain amount of time. When we add it all up, it's about 3 hours and 20 minutes to 3.5 hours a day, meaning any school, even if these regulations are not, what your school normally would do, but you still have 3 hours or more, especially if you're a Hasidic yeshiva, you still have 10 hours to teach all the Judaic studies in the world that you want, right? The inspections that the state is talking about would applied for, it would be once within 3 years of passing these regulations, and then approximately once every 5 years thereafter. Just by contrast, if you own a restaurant where you feed people, health inspectors would come in every single year unannounced, at least once a year, unannounced. We're talking about such a powerful lobby that the state is having a hard time getting them to agree to an inspection once every 3 to 5 years that would be announced and coordinated with the private school community, all to protect tens of thousands of children and the fastest growing population, certainly the fastest growing Jewish population. That should not be so hard, right? We should be surrounded by allies. And I know people like you, Jamie, and others are supportive, and thank you so much for that. But it just feels like we need the broader Jewish community to more proactively join us. This shouldn't be a passive thing. These Hasids, as they're often referred to over there in Borough Park and Williamsburg. No, these are Jewish people. We're part of the Jewish family, and it's the fastest growing part of the Jewish family. And within a few years, we're projecting that by 2030, 30% of Brooklyn's youth, all of Brooklyn's youth, not just Jewish, will be Hasidic. So whether you like it or not, this is going to be the face of the Jewish people. Do you want it to be an uneducated people? Do you want it to be a people disengaged from society, who is not concerned or doesn't even know about the environment and the causes to the problems? This is something that all of us should care about, not just myself because I suffered, not just Beatrice and Javi, but everyone. And that's why I'm so grateful to Jamie and to you and to the many others who really support us. But we should have an army. We should have an army of people who call elected officials. They make it an election issue, right? We're going into a new election year, city council and the mayor. This should be the first question. Will you ensure that our Jewish brothers and sisters get a proper education? If not, get out the door. I'll find a candidate that does.
Strongly said. Javi, could you, yes, you were looking, could you, rather than just ask Naftuli, I wonder if you would talk about, as you mentioned before, about people who show up at the Footsteps office, and among other things, there's so much they don't know, and sometimes they don't know what they don't know. And what is it like working with someone like that? I mean, where has the realization come that, oh my God, this is stuff I should know how to do, but I didn't learn it? What does it inhibit them from doing? And how do you then try to work with them and help them? And obviously, Jamie, you can step in here also.
Yeah, thank you for that question. A lack of education impacts a person in every single area of their life. It impacts, especially for the boys that we're talking about. They're raised in gender segregated yeshivas, so they're only around boys and young men for their whole entire childhood and early adulthood. So this impacts how they socialize. This impacts how the confidence with which they speak or show up in new environments. So just like from the very basics of like the lack of education, how it impacts a person just in how they're trying to show up in the world. And then that spills over into how is a person supposed to, consider big life changes, leaving an abusive marriage or moving somewhere, away from problematic family members or whatever it is. If they can't even imagine standing on their own 2 feet financially and emotionally and building new community, because those are all the pieces that a person needs to survive and then thrive in the world. And so much of the work that we do at Footsteps is helping them process the trauma, the pain of the neglect that they had to suffer in their childhood, and then empowering them and giving them hope and telling them, we'll hold your hand. We have resources. We have, tutors that can help people study for their GED. We have advisors who can guide people on an idea of what's possible for them educationally. And as Jamie mentioned, a tremendous scholarship program that really will tell people, we believe in you. And our faith in our members has actually paid off. We have members who go on to get full educations. We have doctors and lawyers and people who are, just running their families, their households with love and joy and confidence that they can actually make it. But it's not easy to get there. It's a big, big gap that is taken in the early years of childhood when people should be given those tools that are necessary to, like I said, survive and then thrive in life.
Naftuli, just a word or two about what that road was like for you. I mean, you knew you wanted to go to college, you knew you weren't prepared. What happened? Just really personally for a few minutes.
Of course, of course. I mean, I didn't know what college was. People don't comprehend. If the word college ever comes up in a Hasidic yeshiva, it is to say college. It's that, or professors. It's a derogatory term if it ever comes up. But the notion that a boy even thinks of college as an option for him is it just doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in a Hasidic yeshiva. And again, we're talking about yeshivas where in high school, you study all day long Judaic studies, Torah, Talmud, Halacha, all of it taught in Yiddish, right? You don't even speak English. Like I always like to quip just to kind of put it in perspective. An average Hasidic boy in high school utters 2 words of English a day, bus and lunch. That's all, because there are no like real equivalent words in Yiddish. But that's it. And I really mean it. And you leave home when it's still dark and you come home when it's already dark. You don't get to meet people who look differently than you and your father. You don't get to speak with people and to learn anything about other people's cultures, histories. That's an important thing that when you have such a big population in New York State that has never learned history, and I mean the history of slavery in America, of the Civil War, our founding fathers, what the Constitution is, and so on and so forth. So just fast forward, I come out of yeshiva and I have this thing, I see a lot of mental illness in my surrounding community, family, and I'm thinking I feel like I'll be good at it. I'll be a good psychologist. I don't know what it is. I call it a psycholog in Yiddish, right? And I figured let me try. And I go into a college. I kid you not, it's meant for Orthodox people, and it's a branch of Touro College in the edge of Borough Park. And I walk in there, and they practically laughed me out the door and said that I'm not even though it caters to Orthodox Jews, I wasn't ready for that. I went to another branch. They asked me if I had a high school diploma. I was like, I don't know what that is. I was like, I went to yeshiva. I didn't go to high school. What do you mean? Like, so anyway, finally I figured it out. They asked me to write an essay. I didn't know what the word essay meant, let alone how to actually write one. So they tried to teach me on the spot because they really wanted my tuition. It's a small school. And then I didn't know what a register is versus a bursar versus credits, GPA, major, minor, none of this, I knew nothing. And then, I get into college, and then every word the professor says is like he's trying to teach us like concepts, right? Something about a new concept, right? In psychology, right? He's teaching a class of people who are supposed to have gotten an elementary, middle, and high school education. They're learning college. And I'm asking questions. The word you just said, what does that mean, right? Just basic English words. I couldn't comprehend, right? And this was after I had taken multiple remedial English courses, and I had to take remedial math. And I delayed the science till the very end. So like in my senior year, which I was doing part-time, I was working full day in a warehouse. It's a whole story. But finally, I took intro to biology, and I realized that I knew nothing compared. And at that point, I transferred to a CUNY. And I look around, surrounded by regular public school, average public school graduates, and no one had to ask, what is a molecule? Like they've heard the word before. Like even if the teacher was doing a little bit of a rehearsal of elementary, middle, and high school, but at least it wasn't brand new to them to hear for the first time a cell, a molecule, biodiversity, photosynthesis.
Whoa.
But at least.
You're so eloquent. I want to make sure I get a couple of other questions out. What you're talking about, I think people are getting the sense of what this is like for you, what it's like for Javi and Beatrice's kids. One question, which you can answer with a yes or no: do these schools, the yeshivas that you're talking about, continue to get federal and state aid of various kinds? So they do. Even though they don't.
Absolutely, because they would only stop getting funding after a complete investigation found that they're not meeting substantial equivalency. But if you can drag out an investigation for a decade, then you can continue getting funding.
Okay, and without, you've been asked by one of your strong supporters in the chat room to say something about the the silence of Jewish community leaders. So I'm not looking for you to start naming names, but you have been looking for a long time for support for Yaffed and its work. We talked about the fact that the Association of Independent Schools has essentially come in on the other side. Where have you found or not found support in the Jewish community for pushing this issue?
I mean, privately, everyone is supportive. That's the crazy thing. Privately, everyone is supportive. Privately, everyone is like, what's happening is crazy. You should do X, you should do Y. But yes, there's an issue with the organized Jewish community that realizes this is a problem. But believe it or not, they're a little bit like politicians, right? They need certain relationships maintained between them and the Haredi leaders, and they themselves are afraid to speak out, right? Because they see what happens, the consequences, you know, on social media. They get blamed for anti-Semitism and things like that. So it's a big problem. Increasingly, we are seeing more and more support, but it's happening much slower than it should. I mean, I just want to explicitly thank you again, because you with us.
I don't want to take up our last 3 minutes with that. We have 3 minutes left. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with Jamie, just like very rapid fire. Anybody has a last thought they didn't get out, and then Naftuli, if you can list a couple of things that would be helpful for people to do. But let me also remind you and remind our listeners, there will be a follow-up going out probably the beginning of next week. There will be a link to the recording for this program. So those of you who heard it and want other people to hear it, you don't have to remember what they said. You don't have to be the source. That we have it on. We have it on tape, and we will keep listing what people can do. And I want to mention, before I go to Jamie, that there is an important article about Footsteps and some aspects of their work in this week or last week's New Yorker. So check that out as well. Jamie, and then Beatrice and Javi and Naftuli.
Good, thank you. I want everyone to, my final point is one that is a different version, an echo, if you will, of what Naftuli has said. I initially looked at this issue and became allied with it from a social justice perspective of that it is a moral right for all children to be educated in the United States of America and the whole world, okay? So it started with that. But I want to emphasize that there's another issue which is coming before we know it, that we will have, as Naftuli said, 30% of young people within an entire borough of New York City unable to speak English or know the basic rudiments of an academic education, therefore not able to work or contribute. That is not an economic future that is sustainable for New York. Okay, so I really want to just hit home that point.
Thank you. Perfect.
Bigger issue than just a moral issue.
All right, Beatrice, and then Javi, a last thought or two.
I feel like I said my piece. I sometimes feel like it's almost like when you hear people talking about these things, and the more I'm speaking it, the more I see it, that it's just so far away, but it's really real. It's children that have no choice, and it's so important we speak up. I'll also say one more thing. I was interviewed actually for a JCC, and when I started speaking about this issue, it was pretty incredible to see how careful the interviewer was about stating again and again that it's not the official position of the organization. So I hope that will come a time that the large Jewish organizations that support all kinds of social causes will be comfortable standing up strongly for this cause as well.
Beautiful. And you've put a fantastic face on the personal aspects of the story, you and Javi particularly. Javi?
Yeah, I'll just echo what's been said. Please care for our children. They matter too. They're going to grow up to be adults like us, and they need that foundation of a good education. Support the incredible work of Yaffed, support Footsteps, and thank you for showing up today and paying attention to this big issue.
Excellent. And Naftuli?
Yeah, I will just say I'm giving myself and the rest of the attendees here and the many yeshiva graduates give the broader Jewish community permission to intervene. Don't feel like we're distant cousins, we're siblings. You have a right to intervene. You see what's happening. If you're going to stand up for social justice in other parts of the country or the world, please do it first in your backyard. This is where you're needed most. And thank you so much for hosting this.
No, I want to thank all of you. You did the impossible. You put a very complicated issue before our audience from a lot of different perspectives, with great respect for the people whose policies and positions you disagree with, and that actually helps people to try to understand what's going on. So I hope for those of you who know this is an issue that you have found some ways to engage with Yaffed. There's some information in the chat room, and Cheryl Parker, the director of the Center for Social Responsibility at the Marlene Meyerson JCC, will send out more information in the next few days. For those of you for whom this is a new issue, again, I want to just underscore that you heard about it from the most knowledgeable people. You can listen to it, you can get copies of the tape, you can read some things about it, but I urge you to think on it and think about ways in which you can get engaged, because there is, as each of the participants has said, there are a great many lives, educational lives of young people at stake. So thank you all very, very much. Good wishes continuing with Yaffed, and happy Hanukkah to everybody.